So the more work I did on this, the more I realized that there was this really exciting component of children's views that we had yet to tap into. So that's what I've spent the last 15 years or so really trying to explore more deeply. And today, the goal is to present to you and chat with you about why children matter and why their views of the environment in particular, why that's important in the context of environmental education. We'll talk a bit about what the research tells us, what we know, and also I think it's important to point out some of the gaps in the research. What is it that we don't know about how children view the environment? And then, as Hillary alluded to earlier, a lot of my work has been done internationally, and so I'll present my findings from 4 different countries for you, US, China, Singapore, and Sweden. And then we'll round off the presentation with discussions about what this means for us as environmental educators, and certainly also what that means for us as researchers. So as I was telling Hillary, this is, I like sort of interactive presentations. So if there are specific questions that you have in mind, feel free to send Hillary the question, and then we will try to tackle them or integrate them into the presentation. So, first, I think we have to understand or try to understand the question, why children? And the United Nations, this is a particular quote from UNICEF that I really find meaningful because it does speak to the rights of the child. Particularly, I think, in a very adult-centric society that we live in. You know, the textbooks that we use in schools, written by adults for children. The playgrounds that are designed by adults for children. And again, this is one of those things where it begins to ask a more fundamental question, I think, about why haven't we really considered what the world looks like, what the world feels like to children? And to not just to ask those questions, but to really make an effort to integrate those perspectives into the work that we do. Again, not just about research, but in terms of planning environments, in terms of recognizing that children have a set of voices and perspectives that represent their world, or worlds, perhaps. And from a research standpoint, there's also been a lot of work done on children, and that's a challenge, right? A lot of work has been done on children or about children, but really there hasn't been as much research done with children. Sort of recognizing that they bring a particular set of perspectives that should be validated. And so I think the question why children is not just about recognizing the rights of the child, but it's also recognizing that when we do research, for example, it's elevating their position in the research agenda so that it becomes a collaborative effort rather than researchers going into a setting to do research on children. And I think that's really key if we want to understand, truly understand, what the world looks like from their perspective. So this is an image that I took in California with, actually Hillary was there when I took this, on a road trip to Oakland for a presentation. And that's also part of what I do is I use images to represent human environment relationships. And so this is just another aspect of sort of my identity as a scholar. So we've addressed briefly why children, and I guess it'd be nice to think about why children's views of the environment in particular. So this is another image I took actually along the Front Range in Colorado, and I asked this question at the bottom. It says, the caption says, fundamental essence of human environment relationships. What makes us think, feel, act in particular ways vis-a-vis the environment. And the reason I put this picture up is because there's so many questions you could ask about this picture, in particular, how we relate to the image that's there. So for example, you could ask yourself, is this an example of good land use? Cattle ranching, for example. Is that with all these sort of social and environmental challenges and opportunities associated with that, is this considered good land use? A lot of the work I've done with children, particularly with regard to their views of land use, a lot of children have said, well, this is not good land use. And a lot of them have answered that it's not good land use because we haven't done anything to it. We haven't built something that benefits people. We haven't really used it in a way until there is sort of a human imprint on the environment. There's also, if you think about sort of feelings and connections, this image is important to me as well, because when I first arrived in Colorado about 10 years ago, I didn't really understand the connection that Colorado residents had to the mountains. And it's only over time that I've begun to realize this physical landscape has a lot more meaning for people. And there is this intrinsic value system that people have that I've tried really hard to understand, and it's taken me a long time to even think about Colorado as home, because I grew up again in Singapore, which is right next to the ocean. So I find myself connected to water, but ironically, I'm situated in a landlocked state. So for me, environmental views also speak to some of these emotional, psychological connections that we have to the places that we inhabit. And we'll talk more about that as we move along. But I think these images sort of hopefully ask us to think a little bit more deeply about some of these views of the environment that we all have. So what do we know? We know quite a lot more than when I first started doing this research, which was quite a while ago now, it seems like. A lot of the research has been done specifically on children's views of the environment, tell us that the environment, at least the way that children view it, the environment is often synonymous with nature. And this has largely been done through drawings and interviews, mostly qualitative research. Children in drawings would really include things like the sun. It's always sunny for some reason in the drawings. No rain or thunderstorms. Everything is very picturesque. They include trees, birds, flowers, rivers. And it's this idea that the environment is pristine and that really hasn't had much human impact. The research also tells us that children view the environment as a resource that supports human needs. So a lot of times, children will say or draw or write, trees are important because they provide oxygen. And by extension, deforestation is bad because deforestation takes away trees. Therefore, humans would have a hard time surviving because there will be less oxygen. So and again, this is not entirely surprising because research in cognitive psychology tells us that, especially at younger ages, children really do tend to be more egocentric. Not in a bad way, but they really are much more focused on self rather than, say, society. So this sort of supports that particular point of view. What is interesting, though, is that a lot of research tells us that children advocate for environmental protection because it's about the survival of humanity or the human race. Environmental conservation protection is couched in anthropocentric terms, meaning to say the environment is valued because it provides a particular benefit to people. There's terms used like ecocentric terms. So ecocentrism will be the other end of this continuum, where you would say we need to value the environment because the environment has intrinsic value. It's the ecosystems are important because they maintain balance in the earth, for example, and that's more of what we call an ecocentric perspective. Anthropocentrism really does focus a lot on people. And so this is something that's a lot of research has found is children will recognize the need to protect, say, natural resources, but that's because they also recognize the need for land to build apartments so that people have places to live. They recognize that forests need to be protected because there's oxygen that we need. In fact, as much as children recognize the negative impacts of say, of the burning of fossil fuels, for example, children may really recognize the negative impacts of driving too much, but they will ultimately come back to say, well, I think driving is bad, but ultimately I think we need cars to get from point A to point B. So there is a lot of what we do know in terms of children's views of the environment. Well, here's what I think we don't know and should really try to find out more about, and that is how children relate to the environment. What are their feelings, the value systems that they have with regard to the environment? We know how they think about it. We know how they might conceptualize the environment. But in terms of this deeper, more subjective set of connections, we don't really know a whole lot. And that's actually related to the sorts of methods that we've used to understand children's views. In academia or in higher education, a lot of times to get your research published, you have to sort of embrace a more objective lens. And so anything that has to do with, not anything, but a lot of times research that is a little bit more less objective, I would say, that touch on emotions, for example, are really hard. It's hard to quantify. And when you cannot quantify something, typically it's harder to get some of these types of studies published in in certain kinds of journals. So a lot of times the disciplines, even as in environmental education itself, there's been a huge push to make environmental education research much more credible by, again, embracing this idea that research conducted in large groups with large sample sizes using more quantitative approaches are considered more valid and credible. And there is an important role for that. But I also think that with regard to children's views, it's also important to branch out a little bit and see if we can also understand some of these less tangible components of their perspectives. We also don't know how children in different countries view the environment. A lot of the research that's out there on this topic has been conducted in the UK, in Australia, in the US, in a lot of Scandinavian countries as well, but mostly, again, in North America, and actually mostly in English-speaking cultures. So we'll talk a little bit more about the role of language as we move through the presentation. But certainly there's a lot left to be learned in terms of how children in different places who grow up in very different environments, speaking different kinds of languages, how they view the environment and how they might respond then to environmental change. So what what is it that I really do? Well, as Hillary said, I do a lot of things. But the thing that I love to do a lot of is to try to understand how children are thinking using visual methods and interviews. So I ask children to draw a picture of the environment. And then after they've drawn the picture, I sit down with them and ask them questions about that drawing. These can be very specific questions, or they can be really broad questions that are driven by the children's responses. And it's been really insightful over the years to hear what they say about the environment. A lot of my work is framed by social constructivism, which basically means that each of us comes from different backgrounds, and the way that we make sense of the world is different. There is no objective reality that is universal, but that we make sense of the things around us based on a particular set of perspectives and value systems that we individually and collectively embrace. So that's social constructivism, which essentially says there is no right or wrong way to view the environment. I simply want to understand what you think. And so I've used different analytical approaches in my research. Content analysis refers to simply going through a drawing and saying, okay, what do we see here? How many trees do we see? How many flowers? Do we see any buildings? Any signs of human sort of presence? That's sort of a very straightforward content analysis. Thematic analysis refers to going through drawings and interviews to pull out general or broad patterns in children's responses, and then saying, well, what's the big overarching pattern that we see? What are these themes? And a lot of what I've shared with you already in terms of what we know about children's views is really sort of thematically driven. And then finally, and this is of late, I've begun to look at the use of discourse analysis. So not only children's drawings, but how do they speak and write about the environment? Are there specific words, phrases, things that they use to describe and talk about the environment that perhaps speak to a broader worldview? Maybe there's something in children's discourse about the environment that tells us how we, as a general society, have positioned the environment, which has led to some of these views and perspectives to begin with. So that's what I'm currently engaging in with discourse analysis. And I've done work, like I was saying earlier, in different countries. And today I'm going to talk about or share with you some examples of children's drawings and how they describe the environment from these 4 different countries. And most of these places where I worked with children, it was really driven by accessibility. So, it's really, when we do research of this nature, it's more about whom you know and where you are at a particular point in time that allows you to gather some of this data. So I did have a chance to go back to Singapore to get some data. I've been in the US more than 2 decades now, which has given me time to collect drawings as well from children. China is where I've spent a lot of time developing relationships with universities in Nanjing as part of a study abroad program that I lead with students. And ultimately, Sweden is where I spent a year on sabbatical, most recently, about 2 years ago. And these are all venues that are really interesting. We don't have time to go into details, but the work that I've done in these places have only sort of enriched my perspectives, but have given me continued inspiration to try to understand more of how children are viewing the environment. So if CU Denver is willing and to fund me, I'll be very happy to continue this journey. So our first stop is in Chicago, USA. And this is a 6th grader who drew this picture of the environment and defined it as a land with people, buildings and organisms on it. Not surprisingly, again, this is one of those drawings where it goes against the grain in terms of what we know. This child in Chicago, as a very large city, drew pictures of buildings, houses in part, and included cars and exhaust fumes from cars. And interestingly enough, from a sort of, in terms of how this child described the environment, really didn't talk about what was going on per se. Rather, this child described the objects in the picture, which is something that researchers have found to be quite common in English-speaking nations, where the use of English, where the emphasis is on understanding verbs and nouns and adjectives, has led to children describing places by listing what they see or think they might see, which is really interesting. But certainly, context plays an important role here, because for a child growing up in Chicago, it makes sense that there are sort of urban components to the picture of the environment. And even the types of houses that you see there sort of represent the houses that you might find in North America, which we will contrast with some of the other pictures from other parts of the world. So the key here is to think about these drawings as a window into the places that children inhabit. As educators, I think it gives us a sense of what they see, not just visually, but perhaps what's within their immediate realm of consciousness. And this to me is insightful, just in terms of understanding this place that this child grew up in. This picture is a little different, and it is from a 5th grader in China that did not include any sort of urban elements. And the reason I picked this image to share with you is because this sort of represents the prototypical drawing of the environment. What I was describing earlier with the sun and birds, it's a very big bird to the top right-hand corner, and trees and river, and there are fish inside as well. But what you don't see here is the rest of the drawings from Nanjing, China. And for the most part, children in that study sample did include buildings and did include roads. So there is a pattern basically across the work that I've done where children living in urban environments are more likely to draw and include pictures of buildings and roads, and children who grow up in rural environments are less likely to do that. So this child wrote in the response to the question, what is the environment? And this is translated from Chinese, says, a place that has mountains, water, things. The air is fresh, the sky is high, and the clouds are light, which is very beautiful. There are sounds from birds singing, river running, and the grass swaying. The sounds are pleasant and enjoyable. I mean, when I first saw this, it sort of hit me. Very different from the child, Chicago, US. There's not, I mean, there are still objects being listed, but they are described in a way that's almost poetic. This child is not just talking about what's there, but there are elements of that subjectivity I was talking about earlier. The idea that the environment is beautiful, or that the sounds are pleasant and enjoyable, refer to a particular set of feelings and value systems that were not present earlier. And this is interesting because part of what I've been trying to understand too is the way that the Chinese language is structured promotes the use of such phrases as opposed to the English language, which is much more about the labeling of objects. So that's, I think, one linguistic component that I find really interesting. But also the idea that the environment is something perhaps to be felt. And this is a really compelling piece as well, because as environmental educators, I think that's what we try to do, is to develop a love for the environment, a sort of intrinsic motivation to care. And how do we do that? How do we develop those nuanced pieces? And this is, for me, sort of, again, inspirational in that sense. So Singapore, we move to my home country, and this is an 8th grader who defines the environment as beautiful environment. Again, the idea that the environment has sort of this value. It's beautiful. The environment is a place where we live at, and it must be clean, just like that. I think the idea that the word clean is very important because the Singapore government has spent a lot of resources promoting cleanliness in the city. And in Singapore, they call Singapore a fine city. Not because it's fine, but because you get fined for pretty much anything. For chewing gum, which is actually illegal in Singapore. You can't buy gum. You get fined for throwing litter or littering. So the emphasis for this child on the environment being clean is, again, not just representing an individual set of values, but it is a microcosm or window into some of these larger societal contexts, or as I mentioned earlier, this idea of place, this place that the child inhabits. And you'll also see in the drawing, you'll see very few sort of single or double-story homes. What you see are a lot of tall buildings, and that's very much the landscape in Singapore. There's very little space in the country, and so a lot of buildings go up to the sky rather than outwards. And you see that reflected in this drawing as well. And again, being an island, the idea of the ocean being in the drawing is not entirely surprising either. But again, these drawings are not just, it's not just an activity where you say, wow, that's great, let's hang this on the wall here so everybody can see this. Or maybe you might put it on the fridge at home, which is great. But what does it tell us about children's views and their perspectives of the world? I think that's the key here, is these drawings and the writings and the conversations that we have sort of lead to a much richer and certainly oftentimes untapped aspect of education. Is, can we take the time and to really explore these dimensions? And certainly we'll talk about this towards the end, but there are lots of implications for what that means in terms of curriculum and instruction. And finally, this is a drawing from a 6th grader in Stockholm, Sweden. And what you see written at the bottom of that screen is not what the child wrote. This is an excerpt from an interview with the child. I didn't have time during the research study to have them write what they were drawing. And so this is a piece that links to the drawing from this child. And the child says there are more and more humans from different places. For example, from one country to another country. And then it forms, at least I think so, more emission, and then the nature becomes more acidic. So the idea of fish dying in the pond, and you see these furnaces with smoke being emitted from them to the left of the drawing, Those are meant to indicate emissions, and the idea that there's the change, this acid rain is what the child was referring to, and therefore fish are dying. And this is also important, again, from a sort of a contextual standpoint, because in Sweden, or at least in Stockholm at the time that I was there was a lot of migration taking place. There were lots of refugees from Syria, for example, entering Sweden and Germany as well. And so that was an issue that was foremost on not just this child's mind, but also in a lot of children that we interviewed. So it's one of those things where research instruments like this, drawings and interviews, give us a sense not only of what the children are seeing in terms of their immediate environment, but perhaps more so what are their immediate concerns. And I think even though they may not view immigration in the country in the same way as adults might, from say a policy-making standpoint, I think it's also important to think about how their views of immigration in this sense come back to influence how and what they learn about science in this classroom, how they learn about social studies or language arts. There's a lot of connections tied to this child's view of acid rain and the threat, at least from this standpoint, the threat of increased immigration from one country or another into Sweden. So how does that play into how she or he relates other subject topics? So that's why I think children's views of the environment aren't really just about the environment. They are also how children view the environment in relation to other subject areas that they are studying, and indeed relates to how they see the world outside of school as well, outside of home. And when we think about the rights of the child, when we think about children's views, then I think it really is about the whole child, rather than just the child in a particular setting. So what does this mean? What does this data tell us? At least based on the work that I've done, the environment exists in urban settings. It's not just something that is synonymous with nature. The children in these studies certainly have included elements of human presence in their drawings and in their interviews. Again, buildings, roads, cars. And this is important because when we talk about the environment and environmental education, we need to begin to move beyond just outdoor education, but to understand that if we're trying to cultivate environmental literacy, for example, then the environment as it exists in urban settings also need to be a part of that conversation. Certainly, there are differences across cultures, but here's the amazing part, I think, is that there are also commonalities. And when we talk about cross-cultural comparisons, or we talk about everybody having and coming from a unique culture, we tend to really focus on what's different. And what I've come to realize over the years doing this is that there are also elements that are, and here I'm going to use a word I don't often use, are there elements that are perhaps even universal across cultures in terms of how children view the environment. And ultimately, I think, going to that last bullet point, I think the idea of place and language certainly shapes realities. And by realities, I mean it certainly influences how children view not just the environment, how they view their world. And these place and language vary from location to location. So I think that's why, as educators, as researchers, we need more. We need to know more, and we don't know enough at this point. So what does this mean? What are the implications? As I mentioned before, I think the whole child needs to be considered. Not just the child that we have in our classrooms or in our schools, not just the ones in our homes, but who are they in their entirety? Because they relate to so many elements around them. They relate with each other, they relate with us, or hopefully with us. And also they relate to the physical spaces that they inhabit. So I think the point of this research is to say, well, we know this much. Let's try to get at the deeper components of the child in terms of how they're thinking, how they're viewing the world. Place is definitely far more than just a spot on the map, or more than just the building that we're in conducting this webinar. Place has meaning, and these meanings will ultimately vary from nation to nation. It will certainly vary from place to place. I came from Singapore, but I also spent time in Indiana. When I was in Indiana, there was a very different sense of place. Very much more of an agricultural community, for example, as opposed to being here in Denver. So it's, as educators, I think it's not just important to say, okay, we know we have a diverse classroom, or we have a diverse group of participants. And it's important to say, well, we need to look beyond diversity as just race and ethnicity and class, your sort of standard indicators of diversity. There is also a lot of diversity in place. Where are these places that our children or even adult learners, where are they coming from? And how do they relate to those places? Because how they relate to these places then ultimately influences how they're going to make sense of what we are talking about. The information that we're presenting, they're going to make judgments about what's important to retain and keep stuff that they find meaningful. But how do you get to what's meaningful in the first place, right? And I think what's meaningful in the first place brings us back then to this idea of understanding place. And again, finally, I think as educators, I think it's important to understand that as much as we tend to look at differences across cultures, I think we need to also be open to the idea that maybe there's some elements that are common across cultures. And to me, that's really important because it speaks to how we are presenting the environment. If a child in Singapore is talking about the environment in the same way as a child in the US, in China, in Sweden, is there something bigger at work? Is there something systematic, or maybe something that we have institutionalized in the way that we teach about the environment that has now transcended culture? It could be something as subtle as a definition of the environment in a textbook under the glossary, for example. It could be the way that we advertise or that we create messaging about the environment. It could be the images that we choose to put on our flyers, on our posters, or that we put in television programs. It can be, and this is where for me of late, I've been asking, is it the kinds of words that we use, the kinds of phrases and symbolisms that we use to describe the environment that has now sort of trickled across different societies and different cultures? And that's not to say that that's a bad thing. But if the environment is, again, more than just these stereotypical views, how do we address that? How do we think more broadly, globally perhaps, about some of these views that children have with the environment? And I think that for me is sort of a takeaway, is there's a lot more to the learners that we have in our classrooms, again, in the spaces where we interact with them, that deserves more of our attention because of these things. So we come to the course that Hillary actually and I are co-developing and co-teaching for the first time. It's environmental education offered through the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at CU Denver. And this actually is really exciting because it's one of the courses that makes up the Environmental Science Education Certificate in the department and college too. So it's a chance to really link a lot of what I've just discussed with sort of the practical components of environmental education. Hillary, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I believe that, first of all, thank you so much, Bryan, and we're going to feel free, everyone, to type in any questions or comments you have. I know I have a few, but in terms of the course, just feel free to contact myself or Bryan if you're interested in the course. It's all online. There'll be 2 in-person meetings, but there's ways to work around the in-person part as well. And it is open to all continuing education credits, professional development. These will be graduate credits. And it is new. So in terms of being an innovator in higher education, this is new for I believe not only the University of Colorado Denver, but College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the department as well. So we're making steps towards bridging research to practice. And are there any questions? Feel free to type those in the chat box. You know, I was thinking about systems thinking, Bryan, as an underlying or an underpinning concept of environmental education. So, and also thinking about how we, as a former middle grade science teacher, thinking about how I know, I taught about the environment or ecosystems in the classroom. And, we brought in those objects, abiotic, biotic components of an environment. And so, in terms of, my question is, speaking of institutionalizing what we know about the environment and how we educate about the environment, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the institution of formal education or formal schooling and the language that we use or we're educating our children to use to explain or describe or label the environment. Sure. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question and hard to address, only because it's such a systemic issue, I think. For example, the environment or ecosystems, as you described it, is often taught within formal schooling, taught in science. And if you try to think of this as a system where the environment is also linked to human societies, for example, it's also linked to politics and economics, then I think the challenge lies in how we bridge these components in a formal school setting, where, again, the environment has traditionally been labeled a subject that falls under the natural or life sciences, earth sciences. And really, if you think about any environmental issue or challenge, you can't just look at it from that lens. You have to sort of incorporate a much more, as you said, systems perspective that asks and challenges learners to think about these connections. So I think part of it is, as educators, how do we shift that paradigm? How do we move out of those positions where we are compartmentalized into specific subjects? And I think environmental education has to be more fluid in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we have our work cut out for us then.
Yes.
Thank you. We did receive a question through our message board earlier. There was a poll sent out in an email preceding this webinar. And it's from Emily Henderson in Salida, Colorado. And she writes, I see a lot of efforts to expose children to environmental concerns and help them grow a love for their natural resources. But often these efforts are single instances or only reach a small group of students. Do you know an example community that has really built a well-rounded program that threads together different environmental outreaches throughout a child's formative years? So the question is, do you know an example community that has really built a well-rounded program that threads together different environmental outreaches throughout a child's formative years?
That's an important question, Emily. And off the top of my head, I do not know of a community that has built a really well-rounded program. If only because I think well-roundedness in this context, at least how I'm interpreting the question, really isn't limited, I think, to a program. I think when I consider well-roundedness, it really is about both formalized programs or structured learning experiences, but also sort of the unstructured, the non-programmatic sort of experiences that learners have that lead to this idea of well-roundedness. So, and that's what I think we need more of, is looking at the whole child in that sense. So yes, if you do know of any communities, I'd be happy to learn from all of you, because there's a lot more good stuff that's being done, good work that's being done that, again, we're just not quite aware of.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I know of Boulder, St. Vrain school districts are, in thinking that this is kind of a team effort and a collective effort. The Boulder EE Collaborative is taking, mapping out all the programs offered within that area, that geographic area, and within those school districts in the Boulder County area, and then kind of mapping out what programs are offered at different grade levels, just to ensure that there's a continuum or a touch point of environmental education at every age or grade level, and what have you. So not only is it a collaboration between non-formal and formal education and educators, but it also kind of hits at the developmental piece and that holistic piece as well. And so that's in the works. We have a couple of questions on the chat board. So we have the comment, I can't help but to wonder how children view their environment in stress locations around the world, for example, in Syria. Do you have any insight or comments on, have you worked in any stressful locations?
Great question. I think maybe subconsciously I was avoiding stressful locations for my research. No, that's a great question. I've actually read research done in stressful locations. And I can't remember if it's South Africa, for example, where researchers found that children, when they view the environment, emphasize things like violence and how it's very much a part of their everyday lives, and how they wanted opportunities or ways to deal with that, or maybe even to escape it. In terms of children prioritizing what they want to see in the environment, there was definitely a distinct difference between children who lived in less stressful places versus those who lived in really stressful environments. If you think about sort of Maslow's hierarchy, children who lived in these stressful places were really emphasizing safety, roof over their heads, versus other children who were emphasizing things like places for play, for example, or less parental control, those sorts of things. So there definitely is a difference. And yeah, I think again, like I said, much more research needs to be done in that context.
Great, thank you. Great question, thanks. And Kirsten mentions in an earlier post that you had mentioned some of your work in Sweden and Scandinavian countries, and that acid rain is a quite a big issue in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps, you know, the drawings of children and views are representative of larger social structure or manifestation of climate impacts, even, or weather. So very local, but also global based. And
Absolutely.
yeah, there was a question from, additionally, Kirsten added to the conversation. She said she had an interesting conversation with a young man from Oakland, California, who was selling cleaning products in her neighborhood. And he said, "I would love to live here. Listen, you can hear the wind in the trees." And Kirsten says that she felt that he was more tuned into things that many of us take for granted.
That's a great point. I think so I think this hits home the point that if we want to be more aware of our surroundings, it doesn't always have to be about placing learners in natural environments. I think one can be more attuned to their surroundings by being more sensitized to things around them, such as the sounds from the wind or the smell in the air. I think we can develop these senses and develop connections to the environment in both natural and urban settings. And maybe that's one direction that environmental educators can take. I appreciate Richard Loob's perspective in his book, Last Child in the Woods, but I think sometimes that can have a tendency to overemphasize natural environments, and sometimes at the expense of children who do live in places that are stressed or that don't have easy access to the outdoors. So I do think we can be more holistic in that sense. Great point.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kirsten. And then Katie Navin mentions, it will be interesting to see the impacts of the Inspire communities who are working through the GoCo grants to create a well-rounded community effort to connect youth and families to the outdoors. Some of these via trails, connecting trail systems and what have you. So that will be something to take note of. And in terms of, you know, bridging, there's a big momentum right now to try and bridge research to practice. And how can we take some of this research that you're doing, for example, Bryan, and put it to work, use it to inform our own practice as well. And so potentially, you know, do you think this, and we're going to end here pretty soon, but do you think this maybe plays a role in, you know, in terms of how do you quantify what Kirsten had mentioned in terms of, I would love to live here, and that love for the environment? How do you quantify that? And I know you may not know the answer, but that could potentially, in terms of connecting research to practice. And
right. Well, I mean, this is where it gets challenging for educators in situations where accountability now has become sort of the buzzword in formal schools. And I think what we can do, and what I've strived to do in my role at CU Denver, is to recognize that I can give so much information, but I really want students to develop this, love for what they're learning. And I think the way to do that is to be more open, to be a bit more courageous about what we're trying to say, and to recognize that we have our limitations, but that we also have certain ways of understanding the world, each of us, that we need to share. So I think part of what makes this work, or could make this work, is just being more open about these intrinsic connections that we each have with the environment, and share that with our learners. Have them share that with us. I think that builds a much more human-centered, not in an anthropocentric kind of way necessarily, but certainly it speaks to the humanistic elements of why we teach and what we teach and how we teach.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I think that's a great note to end our conversation today. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, let us know. This recording will be available as well. If you're interested in any of the research that Bryan has done, let us know, and we'll send it your way.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I again appreciate the opportunity to do this. If you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And yeah, look forward to the next step with all of you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.